I mean, we can go ahead and get started. Like you said, people will trickle in. They'll catch up where they may, right? So, welcome. Good afternoon. Thanks for being here. The handful that are here. It's actually an honor to be able to present to you all. This is my first time speaking at a conference, let alone an audience like yourself. It's interesting. I've was doing some reflection headed into this session and working in insurance in data for the last decade, and I've only worked with actuaries a couple times, and it was pretty short-lived. But I'm blown away by the data acumen and business knowledge you all have. I know at the standard I work with a couple brainiacs that I'm consistently trying to keep up with. So, with that, we'll jump right in. Pretty cut and dry session today. I want to level set our understanding of data governance, discuss the importance of metadata and data quality, and that really sets the stage for why a tool like data contracts would be important and helpful. We'll talk about what data contracts are and how we kind of articulate and manage those. I'll do a demo and we'll open it up for discussion. Given the group size, feel free to interrupt me whenever, really. Yeah, we'll see how this goes. I mean, I guess before we begin, I'm curious, how many of you are aware of data governance and work with a data governance team at your company? You could either show a reaction on the call or speak up. Cool. Sweet. Well, yeah, I mean, I'll definitely have to follow up. Maybe we could connect, talk shop, and share notes. One of the main goals for me today is just to provide awareness of data governance as a practice area and data contracts. So hopefully you get something out of this. This slide aims to show, my personal journey in my career with keeping up with the data landscape and show different catalysts for data governance. When I first joined the workforce in 2014, at the health plan I was working at, they were going through their first rendition of a data lake, an enterprise cloud data platform. They had their very first chief data officer, and it was a big deal. I was on the business side, whipping out dashboards for leaders, and did that for a few years. And a lot of the pain points I was facing, chalking down definitions between the difference of a proposal, an opportunity, and a quote, or presenting a metric like member count or member lives and seeing that two other teams were calculating it differently. I remember a conversation I had with an architect who was a new hire who mentioned data governance and, hey, like we got to get some data governance going. And that was like a light bulb moment for me. I had never heard that term actually. And this was around 2018 when GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, kind of came on the scene. And shortly after, you see the California Privacy Act. All of this really underneath that speaking to a need to be able to demonstrate, where the data is and how it's used, which were tightly aligned with governance capabilities. You saw like a burst in the marketplace of data governance platforms and tools that provided data cataloging and lineage capabilities. Um, and all of that tied to this need for data strategy. So around 2019, I was able to join the standard during their mobilization phase of the data modernization effort that we've been on, implementing our enterprise data platform. We're on our second evolution of this in Databricks and leveraging those unified capabilities. And through that, and as I was working as a data governance analyst, helping to implement our enterprise data platform or data governance tool, define processes and standards around data management disciplines, I got really interested on the tech side. So I had an opportunity as a data engineer working in our data services team that I'll speak to later. And it was in this experience I got exposure to data contracts. So data contracts, I want to say, are going through like a second wave of popularity right now. I was literally looking at a Databricks open source like catalog that had data contracts incorporated. That was called Ontos. And I think that was released like this week. And then, you know, so going back to 2021, this guy named Andrew Jones, he went on to publish a book about data contracts. In 2023, there was an open data contract standard that was open sourced. So relatively new concept. Um, yeah, so jumping right into the to data governance and defining that, I plucked this from the data management body of knowledge. DAMA International is just a global association for data management professionals. So this reads, hey, data governance is the exercise of authority, control, and shared decision making over the management of data assets. It's a process, organizational function, set of techniques and system for putting business policy and regulations into operation. So big time theme here on people, process, technology. The goals stated by DAMA are to enable an organization to manage its data as an asset. Data as an asset, what does that mean? Assets hopefully gain value. Like I think of this as how do we leverage our data and monetize our data to produce value. Um, Second goal is to define, approve, communicate, and implement principles, policies, and procedures for data management. So as you can imagine, define, approve, communicate, all of that is like people framework, right? And then step three, there's a monitor component, and this is really ensuring compliance and accountability for our data management practices. So yeah, this slide, keying in on that theme of people, process, technology, I'm just going to speak to the people side. I very much believe data governance will live and die by your culture and your data teams really living and breathing data governance. And that starts all the way with executive sponsorship, trickled down to roles like council members and data owners and data stewards, and really having like named resources who fulfill these responsibilities. And then you can get into the operating model of how you organize as a data governance team. Is it centralized? Is it decentralized? And all of that. So I would say one of the most interesting things in my journey has been seeing how it really comes down to people. So what's the scope of data governance? This is a visual that highlights all of the data management disciplines. This is once again plucked from the data management book of knowledge. Maybe there's a dozen or so, 10 different data um, management disciplines. And you as actuaries, I guarantee you work in a flavor or perform an activity that is touches each and every one of these disciplines. And the importance of being able to define the different disciplines is now we can start to break down standards and processes to help, the activities we do for all of these. So what does a data governance team actually do? Like, what do we produce from an output point of view? I have it boiled down to these three buckets, policy, standards, and processes. Policy I treat as a high-level statement, guiding principle that informs our standards. The standards get into a little bit more detail, start to speak to the what and how, and then processes help evidence those standards can be demonstrated. So an example of like a metadata policy Could be something like we want to make sure we're safeguarding PII information. And a standard would be we need to ensure all of our PII data elements are tagged and assigned ownership. And then a process would be during the ingestion and onboarding into the enterprise data platform, a data contract is filled out and these tags are evidenced. So you can kind of see how taking that walk from high level kind of guiding principle all the way down to how it's evidenced out. At the standard, our vision is both grand and straightforward, and that's simply empowering people with access to data, high quality and trusted information that's easily understood. And that comes down to kind of three steps, identifying the data that's critical, classifying that information, and monitoring it for quality. Hmm. As you can imagine, each of those three steps is a lot more to it, but if I were to give the pitch, it's really just those three steps. So why does this actually matter? We hear all the time the term being data driven, and I heard this once and it really resonated with me. In order for us to be truly data driven, we ought to be able to answer questions about our data, where it came from, if it was correct or not, and who supports it as examples. Thinking back to my time as a data analyst, just spinning out dashboards for various leaders in a certain meeting, like, did they have the capability to be able to answer this kind of stuff? Am I doing my due diligence to ensure that we can demonstrate, and answer these questions quickly? Revisiting the wheel and really highlighting metadata and data quality. When you look at this wheel, it's really hard to show which one's more important than the other. It can be pretty overwhelming and kind of like a boil the ocean view. And that's where this spin of it comes into play. This is called the Peter Aiken pyramid or the Aiken pyramid. Peter Aiken's a lifelong data practitioner, and I think he's currently the president of DAMA. But I love this view because it's intuitive to know and see that, hey, data governance, data quality, and metadata management are all foundational um, disciplines to data and data management. So this is really where we focus as a data governance organization is just on these three disciplines. Obviously, things come up, on the top of the pyramid, et cetera. But creating the policy standards and processes around these are our main focus. So yeah, I know that was an earful. At this point, any questions or things you're curious to know more about before we jump into data contracts? Cool. Well, like I said, at this point, we've gone over data governance, the importance of metadata and data quality, and now we're going to dive into data contracts. So I'm going to take a moment to share a personal story with me. From my experience. This is working back on the data services team. So this team was responsible for an API service that supplied data to our external facing portals. So a use case for the portal could be an HR benefits manager at company X wanted to see, who's out on disability and the status of their claim, billing information, etc. So every page and widget um, in the portal would query our data service for that data. And we had multiple product teams we were working with. There's like three different portals. We had over 40 endpoints and new requests were constant. So when we met with portal teams consuming our data, we often referred to the API endpoint as a contract. And we discussed how it was going to be queried, things like what attributes we're filtering for, what grain the data was. And this was important for us not only on how we built the endpoint, but how we modeled the data for low latency queries. This was in a NoSQL database in the back end. And so, all that to be said, at some point we got comfortable and we started making assumptions and glossing over data requirements, like if the field was required or not. So, for instance, we would do a really good job piecing down the requirements for how the endpoint was being used and what data was important there. But beyond that, all the supplemental information we would provide in that response payload, we didn't get down to the data quality expectations as much as we should have. So this ended up biting us in the rear. We had a production incident the day of an important release where one of the page widgets had an error because a required attribute was null. And this led to our own internal churn to figure out what went wrong, not only like in the current incident, but like how did we get to that point? My team was in the middle, towards the end of a very complex data value chain, and we realized despite all of our efforts, you know, producing the data, doing the source to target mapping, the QA, the data analysis, we weren't capturing our data expectations in a meaningful way that really could have prevented this. And so this was truly the moment of inspiration for me to look into data contracts. Um, I got an after hours call that day that from my boss, and it was just not an ideal situation. I still don't feel good about it to this day. So yeah, I share that in hopes that by the end of this meeting and seeing the demo of a data contract, you'll be able to see how a contract could have prevented an issue like that. So what is a data contract? A data contract is purely an agreement between data producers and data consumers. And it helps articulate just the data values that they're receiving. And ours is focused more towards data quality. So we use contracts as a format to express data quality rules in a relatively business-friendly way. Another key attribute of data contracts in our implementation is it's a standardized code artifact. So it's a YAML file. This allows us to, it's, human readable, machine readable. We can easily parse it and use the information downstream. We treat it like a code file in that we manage it in Git. So there's all the source control capabilities we have. We can collaborate effectively. There's kind of a natural phase gate, so to speak, with a pull request. All of that speaks to, the YAML file's utility. And then, like any good process, we have a life cycle associated with that, with descriptions of all the activities that lead into managing contracts effectively. So on the far left, you have the first phase, which is creating the contract and simply producing the draft contract. And then we move into, so that's more of like a template. And then the definition phase, this is where all the time sync is. This is create and define is during the data development stage. We would be going through with stakeholders, capturing business and technical metadata, expressing data quality rules accordingly, and filling out this template. When it's ready to be published and applied to data, this is kind of in tandem with the path to production for data. You would go through a pull request, and that pull request has CI/CD capabilities like the linting and validation of the contracts before they're merged. And then once they're merged, they're deployed to the Databricks workspace in a volume, and that's where our jobs can pick them up. And then, as these jobs run and produce outputs, there's a review process of, hey, what's the data quality score looking like? What validations failed? Do we need to adjust the data or the contract? What's the remediation for anything coming out of this? So the next few slides are going to kind of dive into each of these. I'm going to gloss over them. The intent here was just to show how we're trying to support our internal teams through each of these phases. Um, this table shows, what the phase is, the inputs needed, the outputs, who's involved, who's driving the activity, and then supplementary like documentation and stuff. What you may know here in the activities, this we have a lot of our processes orchestrated with Azure DevOps pipelines. So for instance, this create phase, a user is able to run one pipeline and within that pipeline, create a dev branch, run the job that profiles your data, generates the template contract. It's proposing rules out of that process, copies it into the branch, and then they're ready to go into the definition phase. So that takes minutes if their data is in a decent spot from a development point of view. Um, and then, in the define phase, this is all manual, taking all the information from the stakeholders' brains and putting it on paper. But we try to support them through that, as well as the publish phase has automation once again, where you can run a pipeline off your dev branch. That's going to take your contract and deploy it, copy it into the Databricks volume, run the job. You can see the results of the contract run, so you can kind of test it out. And then, the pull request is very collaborative. A lot of comments back and forth, different contributors reviewing the contents of the contract. And the beauty of the pull request is like you can see there's traceability to all of that and changes as the versions evolve. This validate phase, same deal. The things I'd highlight here are the outputs we're getting. So there's a couple things that happen with our validate pipeline. We're ultimately taking the rules from the contract and applying it to the data. We're able to then aggregate like a data quality score. We're producing a contract articulation score as well to keep track of like how well we're articulating it. Like, are we filling out on the fields and whatnot? We take all that information and we upload it to a catalog in Databricks to keep track of all the contract changes over time. And we break it into different tables. Like we have a table specific to SLA properties as an example. And I know our, director of the data platform is super curious about that. And now he has a one-stop shop for all the SLAs. We take all that information from the contract and we update Unity catalog with tags and table comments, etc. And then we have a process that also updates Calibra with team information and links from business terms to the columns themselves. And then we have an integration with Unity Catalog and Calibra already that takes all the technical metadata anyway. So yeah, a lot happening here. And the review phase, like I said, is just a manual process of reviewing the outputs. Any questions about any of that? I can scroll back to this slide or any others. Take a moment of pause before we do the hands-on demo. Nope. All right, sweet. So let me flip out of the presentation. And then let me go through this dealio here. All right, so can you see my Databricks workspace? I have a contract up. Yeah, I think we're good. Sweet deal. Thanks, Darren. Yeah, so this is an example contract. It's articulated to a degree. This is totally fake information and data, so some of it may not make sense. But from the top down, we have information that's, captures the name of the contract, the version, and the status. Table level information, like the description of the table and the usage. The table tags are super important for us. We use these, for search use cases and helping us identify what's critical or not, what has PII. Tags are an important component in Databricks with attribute-based access control, which is something we're actively exploring. And from what we've seen, it's awesome. Um, there's team information. So this is really capturing key roles from the producer and consumer teams for this data object and, and listing those named people. SLA properties. For us, timeliness is really like the main one. So this would represent kind of a daily batch by 9 a.m. Situation. We use the Open Data Contract Standard for inspiration. What you'll notice if you were to compare, our specification to theirs is we're like 80% copying theirs, particularly on the SLAs. So, if you were interested in that, I would definitely check out their documentation. And then we have this concept of table level quality rules. This would be when we're looking at things at a set level. One example I'm going to demo is looking at quote unquote row by row comparing row by row aggregated amounts at a day level, and then, is their variance significant? Some actuaries I've worked with in the past, they do a lot of like month to month type stuff, and a lot of the data over time and checking variances is just like a brief indicator of like, okay, is there anything I need to dive into? As an example. And then, so we have this, the ability to have multiple, n number of quality rules at a table level. And there's our own custom form of properties that help us take this information and route it to the functions that actually perform the check. So we're looking for keywords at this logical operator value, um, certain properties, and validating like, hey, does a SQL file exist? All of that happens behind the scenes. And then we have table level information, really getting down to the columns. And we had two buckets. This was something that was unique to our implementation, where we had this concept of properties used downstream and properties not used. So this came about when Salesforce tables, as an example, some of them have 500 columns, and we're really just using 20 of them. And despite ingesting all of 500 into our data lake, um, we really know just by usage, like critical ones are those 20. So we use this as an opportunity to focus on the first wave of getting these contracts out the door. Um, Teams can bucket the properties or the columns by that, and then there's stricter requirements for defining metadata that's for data that's actually being used. So you'll see that. And then things like business names, this can link to a business term that's in our business glossary, capturing a data definition, describing the data type. This isn't relevant, but I wanted to show it. The only column level tag that we really care about is this PII type. And that allows us to create ABAC policies off of this. In Databricks, you can create like a tag policy, and it becomes a governed tag, and you can set the allowed values. And so based on that, we can take this information and dynamically generate access control policies, really. Um, Down here is where all the magic happens. This is our spin on expressing data quality rules. It is heavily inspired by DQX, Databricks Labs DQX. That is the underlying data quality rule engine. And they even have their own proprietary format available in YAML as well to configure data quality rules. We ended up sticking to our own custom format. because actually at the genesis of this, we weren't using DQX as the underlying data quality engine. Um, and so with contracts, it kind of serves as this nice abstraction layer. And then, because we can control it, we can manage the change that users have to deal with in terms of expressing data quality rules. And so we'll kind of handle that in between taking this information and passing it to the data quality engine to apply the data quality rule. So we kind of went with the notion of database constraints. That's familiar for people who work in databases from a quality point of view, and this notion of a check constraint. So we have like nullability, uniqueness, and then check constraints. And there's a number of different check constraints, a whole library that's provided from DQX. So going back to this logical operator concept, this points to the function you want to apply, and then there's additional properties that are used as parameters into those functions. Um, so this is saying, okay, is this start date in this format? So this is a format check. This is ensuring that there's no negative amounts. This is, a categorical data field, something you might see with like statuses of a claim or of a process. Um, this is checking to ensure that the value in the row is in this list. And then there's this really powerful one, once again, provided by DQX called SQL expressions, right? So you can kind of craft your own SQL expression as well as like chain sum. So you could do like, and the amount is greater than or equal to, I don't know, 500, right? So now it's going to go through your records, and anything that breaks this rule is going to get flagged. So let's go ahead and run the um, like a trim down validation pipeline. And this does a couple things. So the first thing it's going to do is, from a validation point of view, is ensure that the contract properties are all fitting our specification. And we also do this in the linting process and the PR check pipeline before it gets merged, but we also do it in the job. And then the second check we do is we take all the columns from the contract and their data types, and we compare that to all of the columns and their data types in the table and it has to be an exact match both ways. So this helps us flag schema drift situations where the column isn't the right data type or it's missing. And then we have our functions that apply DQX. And so you pass in a data frame and you get one back, and that data frame has additional columns on it. This is part of the DQX engine, and one of the features that I loved immediately the second I saw it. So they'll take your data frame and append additional columns such as errors and warnings. And this is specified by the rule criticality level. So as you can imagine, not every rule is of equal importance. And so in error rule, you're going to react to differently than a warning. So you can set that criticality with that criticality property. Everything defaults to warning in our usage, but you can set that. And then same with like the uniqueness and nullability constraints, you can set a criticality level. So I'm going to go ahead and change some stuff in the contract. You can see in the last run I did 20 minutes ago or an hour ago to kind of make sure it's all working right. Some of the outputs here with the rules expressed. So it'll give us the name of the rule, the value that failed. So, hey, this is saying negative 500 in column amount is less than 0. We set a rule is not less than. So what this is really giving us is row level, column level, value level visibility into a data quality issue. And then we have the filtered data set that we can quarantine or react to. But let's look at how we express that rule in the contract. So we were looking at, not less than zero. This rule being applied to amount was able to flag all the records that didn't fit it, and it had that information along with it. So I didn't run this before with the and amount greater than or equal to 500. So you can see how this will react to this chained rule. I'm just going to rerun this cell. And so you can see now it's pulling out, or it's flagging all of these new records. And the amounts are less than 500. And if I were to scroll to the right, what was the criticality set at error? Yeah, so these all errored out. And we can take this information and log it for our own tracking. And there's a lot of information out of the box from DQX. So I'm going to get rid of that. And then I guess another interesting bit to show some of the other validations working. This is a column that doesn't actually exist in the data table. And then I'm also going to add in some properties that just don't make sense, I guess. So this would be like if a business user added things that weren't actually part of our specification. And then yeah, let me just start there. So if I run this, we should get some errors. So this is saying, okay, error parsing the data contract, unexpected keys for schema, beep. And then it kind of tells you like what the expected keys are. So that caught that. And then this should catch, the mismatch in the schema. So column bunk, not found in the data set. If I were to change this data type, on the ID from integer to string, we should also see that as well. Yeah, so it's saying, okay, column ID string not found in the data set, column ID int found in the table, schema but not in the contract. So this just gives, visibility into that. This information, although it may feel like overkill and it's a lot to express, it's very rich metadata. And in essence, like this codifying it in a data contract gives us the traceability to our data requirements. I mean, particularly on quality expectations, I think this does a really clean job of capturing some of those. Any questions after seeing this? Gut reactions? Do you all have similar practices? You know, um, or have looked into data contracts or use a data quality engine that has YAML configurations? I know almost every single one in the marketplace does. So I'm curious if anyone has any thoughts at this point. No, sweet deal. Okay, cool.
Um, this isn't exactly the same thing, but
Yeah.
an issue we've run into is like we think we're getting a particular field, but it doesn't
Mm,
actually have the same value. Like they put two fields into one and we only get one or the other, that kind of thing. And I
right.
don't know how to catch that with something like this.
Yeah, I mean, when you say two fields into one, are you saying like like the schema hasn't changed, but the values themselves have? And
Yeah,
and then the value exceeds the format you were expecting?
no, like they both meet the format we're expecting, but they like depending on some switch, like one has one meaning and one has the other.
Oh,
So,
that's
um,
interesting.
well, like any, not just that, like other things where it's like the data's kind of hidden. You know, it's like we would only catch it if you were digging deep.
Hmm. How do you have? I'm sure there's a bunch of different troubleshooting and debugging stuff you have to do in those scenarios. But I'm also sure, like, do you have like a handful of queries that you often use to check for that kind of information? Or, because I can't quite picture exactly the scenario you're describing, but I can,
Yeah,
um,
I don't know if you know healthcare claims, but the healthcare in this situation, there's a revenue code and a procedure code,
mhm.
and they send one or the other. But
Oh,
they don't send both, and but they
okay,
stick them in the same field. We have to figure it out. Um, yeah, we have those checks, but we always build those checks after we find a mistake,
right.
right? Like there's no way to predict what the thing is that needs to be checked until it happens.
Hmm. Hmm. No, I appreciate the detail and thanks for sharing this. So, I mean, in that record, I would imagine there are other attributes that allow you to, discern or like, is this a procedure code or not, right? Like, you can kind of
Yeah,
chain certain considerations. Like, that's where I think a SQL expression would make sense, right? Where you're like, hey, if this value equals this and this equals that, and then this is in in that list, you know what I mean? Then we would be able to flag them. Depending on the complexity of it, I would coach people to use a custom SQL rule. So you would write a custom SQL query and it would get orchestrated, here as a table level rule. And then that just simply gets managed as a file we have like a directory that we would call a rule library. And this has all the SQL files associated with contracts at a table level. And so an example of how they work is you really have to return one value and one column, one value, and that gets compared to a logical operator that we have here. So like the this query is basically saying, give me the count of all the records where this rule fails, where the percent change is greater than 100%, right? And then I'm kind of staging it up by doing the aggregation at a date level, doing the window to get the previous amount, and then simply just saying, do we have any spikes? Um, that then gets orchestrated when this is run. And then if it does, well, then this will fail. And so what you see here in the validation is our table level rules. So this rule does fail because there's, we could look at the data, but you'll just have to believe me. But so this fails and now we can react to it. So from a maturity point of view, our goal is to integrate data contracts into the data pipelines that are ingesting data, that are curating data, and this can be applied to the data while it's being processed. And within that process, we can notify whoever may be, or depending on the criticality of the rule, we can decide to filter out that data and quarantine it, or once again, stop the flow of data. So going back to your situation, that's how we would approach it with the data contract. Does that kind of make sense? I know that was
yeah,
an earful.
that makes sense.
Awesome, cool. Yeah, and it's interesting. I'm gonna. Well, we only have 10 minutes, so okay, let's jump back into it. Um, Here, let me. All right, can you see this slide? Yeah, I think we're good. This is really sharing more technical kind of inspirations to this. If you're really curious about it, some buzzwords I would look up if you haven't heard them before is like metadata driven architecture. This is kind of where you have like one pipeline that you know processes configurations of a thing. And so instead of creating thing specific pipelines, you just have one more robust pipeline that can handle things. So we that's how we've approached our like data ingestion, so to speak, at the standard, but it also is a mentality that we've taken with this, right? Like a data contract is a configuration. You create the one um, utility and job that processes them, and boom, there you go. And then Databricks Labs DQX, huge shout out to that open source data quality rule engine. It's been awesome to work with. And then some of the open data contract standard as well would be a good first stop if you're curious to learn more. Um, all right, change management. I'm going to breeze through these last slides because we'll open it up for discussion. Change management is huge when it comes to data governance and people. And data contracts, in a way, we're pumping the brakes and implementing a lot more rigor, right? And so there's a huge change with that. And, what I like to share, and hopefully this resonates with you, is you are already doing data contracts. So you're already working with teams and creating these agreements on what the data should be and how it should be. And, that's happening in meetings. That's being captured in Jira tickets, Confluence pages, emails, spreadsheets, all the supporting documentation, even in the code itself. There's, all of this rich metadata. So you're already doing data contracts. We are simply trying to live into a standardized format and call it what it is and really lean into that as an artifact. So, one last bit, and I'm no expert in any of this. I heard this once from a change management professional I worked with on a project, and it just stuck, and I love it. But it's this acronym called ADKAR. Um, and that stands for awareness, desire, knowledge, ability, and reinforcement. And so meetings like today to broaden your awareness of a concept, we have to do this internally. We have to go on the road show and sell it and build the desire and try to coach them on what's in it for them and building the knowledge. And then with the rollout of new things like this, there's the reinforcement that's necessary for it to stick. That's why you see things like where we're trying to meet users halfway and like the properties used downstream as an example. It's like, I get it. You have 500 columns in this source object you're using. Um, but, let's focus on what's actually being used and critical. Don't worry about everything else. Let's just get this going. Let's build this muscle. So I think a lot of this helps me kind of frame into these kind of efforts. Um, the only reason why I bring it up is like with data governance, this is truly where rubber meets the road. So yeah, my final takeaways here. Data governance is a team sport. It all comes down to the people. It is a cultural thing. Data contracts is a cultural thing. Talking to the data at a level of detail, prioritizing data quality expectations and capturing that from a requirements traceability point of view. And then really keying in on that data quality and metadata, right? So 99% isn't good enough. 1% of bad data can make you lose a customer group. It can make you a metric wrong and inform decisions differently. We should not shrug off any incremental improvement to data quality we can gain. Similarly, metadata, is a love letter to the future, often our future selves. When we look back at a code artifact or process we're managing, any documentation in the form of business and technical metadata is gold. And hopefully through this presentation, appreciate you hearing me out. I hope you can see how data contracts as an artifact can help evidence some of your metadata and data quality standards. That's it. That's all I had. I know we got 5 minutes left. Any questions? Um, Gut reaction to what you've heard today?
Thanks, Stan. I really appreciate it. I wish I had more to contribute, but being that we're both at standard, everything you talked about was the stuff that I was learning about. So,
Nice.
but yeah, thank you so much for attending, everybody. And obviously, the everything's recorded, so if you need to come back and take a peek, feel free. And yeah, Stan. So I know there wasn't too many people here, but people
Yeah,
will have access to the content all year. All the people who signed up. So hopefully they'll keep
cool.
watching.
Awesome. Well, thanks for being here, Jason. Appreciate the participation. Hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Thanks all. Have a good day.
Bye.